Okay, so let's get started. So good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Head of Adult Programming at Wilton Library. I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture and lecture series, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Now, because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. He may offer a couple of opportunities before the end to get some feedback while we're going through the presentation. I'll let him just mention how he wants to run that. And Mark is also happy to answer questions that you can email him later. I know several of you do that. Anyone needs his email address, just let me know and I will send it to you. Looking over the assignment list, I think we're all pretty familiar with Mark's illustrious background and literary resume. So I will dispense with the long intro and we'll just get started. Mark.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for the abbreviated introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for showing up. I believe you're out there. I want to say that for this quartet of novels, I'm going to talk about each one the night they're assigned, but I'd like to think of them in terms of two pairs, Native Son, 1940, coupled with The Tree Grows in Brooklyn, 1943, as extreme examples of the range of what literary realism can be. I think it's fair to say it'd be hard-pressed to find two novels of realistic fiction, that is, books that purport to be about characters who are like real people. You can make an argument that one of these novels is more realistic in terms of that kind of verisimilitude than the other, but both are set in urban environments in the 20th century of families who are disadvantaged in one way or another, and they're meant to be read as if these characters are people, and yet they're wildly different, and I'd like to talk about that over the course of our two meetings. And then when we turn to our two novels from the 1950s, The Catcher in the Rye, 1951, and On the Road in 1957, I'd like to talk about those two, pairing them again. You don't have to read On the Road any earlier than its assigned date of October 27th. But what they have in common is people in America who feel themselves out of touch with their time for one reason or another. And that becomes a touchstone of the 1950s. That sense of alienation or isolation is very much a mid-20th century cultural marker. So what I'd like to do this evening, and I will be taking comments from you all because The Native Son is a book that even today, let alone when it came out over 80 years ago, strikes many people as controversial or shocking. And I think that's the only way to talk about that is to get Bruce to weigh in. So after I speak for a few minutes, I'd be very interested for anyone who either read it in any kind of academic context or anyone who's encountered it recently. And let me make clear, when I say academic context, it's not that I'm privileging that. I don't think that's more important than someone who read it on their own or read it with a book group. It's just that I'm always interested in how it's pitched when it's taught in an academic context and at what grade level. So I hope to give some flavor of what's happening in America in the 1940s that feeds the power of Native Son. On the basis of it, Richard Wright came to be called the father of African, or back then Black American literature. It was selected as soon as it came out as a Book of the Month Club selection. They expurgated part of it without his permission, which was only discovered sometime later, and it took until the 1970s for the novel to be restored by the Library of America. It sold 250,000 hard copies in its first 3 weeks. That would be a bestseller by today's standards. It all at once made Richard Wright, who was not unknown, but not wildly successful, it made him all at once a very wealthy man and a significant figure on the American landscape, got him a lot of great attention, I think well-deserved. And it continues to be a book, as I said, that some people find impressive, some people find troubling, some people find impressive and troubling. So I want to say that it's clear if you read the novel, even as a quick read, that it's not a novel of realistic social fiction in the way we expect of a novel. Bigger is given great credibility. The kind of narration in this novel is that the camera is kind of on his shoulder, and so it's third person oriented narration. We're talking about him with pronouns and his name and he and his, but the talking about him is always through his lens. We are never anywhere where he's not. And so if you think of it cinematically, the camera's on his shoulder. We can agree, I think, that the other characters in the novel are more or less props, especially the white characters who seem to play roles. Even his family, who have some more realism, aren't given much development. Same thing is true of his friends. I don't think that was a failure of imagination on Richard Wright's part. He's much more interested in the message than the medium, and it is very much a message novel. It begins with the clang of an alarm clock, waking Bigger up reluctantly, and it ends with the clanging of the metal door in his prison. And between those two clangs is a book of extraordinary violence, fear, deprivation. If you read a novel that has 3 books, and they're called Fear, Flight, and Fate, you know you're reading a novel of ideas. If it were a different novel, it would be allegorical. It's not quite allegorical, but loaded with symbolism. Fear, flight, fate, and no freedom. There's no fourth F, no freedom. And fear permeates the entire novel. And in terms of literary fiction, and for those of you who may be new to my talking, when I say literary fiction, I'm not being snobbish. I mean fiction that considers what's happening in the book realistic, and that the characters have psychologies and motivations and interior lives, not genre fiction, stock fiction of romance or thrillers or mysteries and so on, Westerns, all fine, but not what we're talking about. And so it's a rare novel that is not, in fact, a mystery novel or a thriller or a war novel in which the dominant emotion is fear. And it's very bracing to me. It was when I first read this novel, well before I thought I'd have a career as a teacher of literature, how good it is conveying that an urban Black young man, whose name clearly is a smushing together of the word bigger and the word bad and the N-word, which I'm not going to use, but you all know it, and that he quite audaciously is writing a novel where the protagonist is a bad N-word and pushes that together into that odd first name. It's a novel of ideas that becomes less novelistic and more saturated with ideas as it goes on. So I think it's fair to say that the fear section is very, very well paced and engaging, and extraordinary how quickly things go from his triumph over this rat to his fighting with Gus to mask his own fear, to the horrible events that happen with Mary. And then a little less tightly structured, but still realistic in Flight. And then the novel takes a very distinct turn with Fate. Many people judge the novel by how it ends and don't like that ending. It becomes very prosy. Wright turns from showing to telling, and the white defense attorney gets a lot of the coverage. But Wright in 1940 was bringing up an idea that was new, which is this man is guilty but he should get some kind of leniency, not because he's mentally ill, but because he's culturally deprived. And that idea that culture is at fault is a dominant theme in a lot of literature of the 1940s, and it gets extended in the 1950s to the same argument made not about Blacks, but about teenagers. I'm not suggesting that teenagers in the 1950s are the new Blacks, but the idea was there was something about teenagers and their special needs and deficiencies that was troubling to society. And whether it was Rebel Without a Cause or Catcher in the Rye, or any number of ways in which the teenager became ascendant in the 50s, 1956, a year after Rebel Without a Cause, Elvis is on Ed Sullivan, and they're not shooting him from the waist down because, you know, he gyrates. There's a lot going on in a shift in America and its values. And let me say now that at the time that I came to the library in person, at the end of the last series, we were doing The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. And one of the people who questioned me asked, appropriately, a good question, what makes this a great American novel? And I want to make it clear that even though I began the series with the idea of great American novels, it's harder and harder as there are more novels, more novelists, more Americans to talk in terms of a great American novel. So what I've been doing in the last two sessions, and will do with this series, this season, is talk about very good American novels that reflect something not only about American literary culture, but American culture. So this opening with the clang of an alarm, that's the word that's used, clanged, and then ending hundreds of pages later with another clang in the prison, gives you the sense of this is fear that only leads to the fate that is self-annihilation. A novel loaded with deprivations, loaded with a violent reaction to so many things, bigger yo-yos between indifference or complacency and violence. And it's almost as if Richard Wright is being so audacious to up the ante that first Mary, who's only a few years older than Bigger, is suffocated. Then she's going to be burned in a furnace, but she won't fit. And so she has to be decapitated, which he starts doing with a knife and then winds up doing with a hatchet. And then later on, Bessie, his girlfriend, can't be left behind as someone who might give testimony. So she is raped and stuffed into an air shaft. Now, that's horrific. And I do think that part of the challenge Richard Wright set up for himself is to show white America, not the only readers of the novel, of course, but the people he was writing for, that the worst kind of thing you can think about that a Black man could do in 1930s America, it's set somewhere in a city like Chicago in the 30s, still can be understood in terms of society's treatment of African Americans broadly. He is making a strong case by not, and I mean this pun intentionally, whitewashing who Bigger is. So the novel is loaded, like many novels of ideas, many message novels, again, fear, flight, fate, with many symbols, and some of the work of the literary narration, trying to convince us that this is a real world, are done by those symbols. So he fights to the death with the rat. He has a very vicious and degrading fight. He's degrading to Gus. A very horrific, violent encounter with the two women in different parts of the novel. And he is surrounded by images of claustrophobia and circumscription. The family of four live in a very small apartment. When he goes into Mary's bedroom, it is unusually small relative to a wealthy person's house. It seems as if when Mrs. Dalton comes in, there's barely space for Mary on the bed, bigger next to her, and Mrs. Dalton coming in behind. A scene, an image of that circumscription, that claustrophobia, is when Mary is stuffed into her trunk, even dead, just horrific to think about what's happening to her body, and more horrific when she's put into a furnace she can't fit into, and a similar kind of violation of the body in very narrow space in that air shaft that he throws Bessie's body into. The blizzard and the blockading of his chance to get away by the snow, which is literally white, but also symbolically the whiteness figures that he can't get away from the snow, he can't get away from justice. When he goes to the Daltons to take the chauffeur's job early in the novel, there's a white cat who leaps on his shoulder. When Mrs. Dalton, the blind Mrs. Dalton, comes into Mary's room, not knowing that anyone else is there, she is described multiple times as a white blur. And whiteness as a blur, as a veil, the snow makes it hard to see, is everywhere through the novel. That's one consistent symbolic sort of web. Another is the idea of time, the clicking of the alarm clock. There's a clock in the Dalton's home that he hears ticking when he's being interviewed. There's a clock in Mary's bedroom. The first two sections of the novel begin with his waking up. The first section ends with his going to sleep. When he's sent to prison, in the third section, where life has radically changed now, he's no longer fearing and fleeing, he's encountering his fate. After two openings with waking up, the first section and the second section, those two books begin with his waking. The second section, when he's arrested, ends with, "Kill that black ape." Two men stretched out his arms as though about to crucify him. They placed a foot on each of his wrists, making them sink down deep in the snow. His eyes closed slowly, and he was swallowed in darkness. That's the last image of book two. So on white snow, as a Christ figure, which in case you miss, Wright has his narrator tell you, and against that white snow, this black man is swallowed in darkness. So does the next section, Fate, begin with another rude awakening, a waking up? No, it says, there was no day for him now, and there was no night. There was but a long stretch of time that was very short, and then the end. So with that transformation from his being apprehended, and we know that he's guilty of one thing, but they're going to claim that he's guilty of something else. Bessie has the sense to say to him, you're a black man who killed a white woman. They're going to say you raped her. That's just the way the white mentality works. And Bigger realizes that's true, and that they're going to execute him more for the raping than for the murder. And anyone of a certain age knows the truth in that in the history of 20th and sometimes 21st century America. So he steps out of time, and the novel takes a radically different tone. If you're interested in the novel as a novel of ideas, you may find the last section very satisfying. Certainly when I have discussed this book with younger readers, I've never taught it in the official course, but I've talked about it and had seminar type groups with college students. They have great difficulty when the novel stops being novelistic. But what I just said about the clock, the snow, the claustrophobia, those symbolic patterns are a legitimate way that novels can work. And then instead of having realistic characters surround the protagonist, it has understandable reflections of reality in symbols. And everything points back to Bigger, the native son, the young man who is a product of this American culture. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and take some comments. I'd be especially interested in hearing from you what you thought of the novel when you read it, whenever you did. And since we'd like to get more than one comment, and since there's over 70 of you, maybe you'd be good enough to just keep it to a couple of sentences in this first go round. So Michael?
I will pass them on as people put them into the Q&A.
Thanks.
One of the things I was wondering about if, and I had to do something during your first couple of minutes, so if you said this already, I apologize for asking you about it. But do you think this is one of the first novels that really raised the idea that, criminal deviant behavior was partially, mostly, largely the responsibility of society rather than the perpetrator?
Well, it's not my expertise. And of course, I don't read broadly in popular fiction. I read classic novels. I read works in the canon. But I will say, in that context of famous or influential American novels, it's certainly one of the first that I know. There is a movement in Hollywood during the 1930s to make an argument through film that the Bowery Boys, before they were a comedy group, when they were in Angels with Dirty Faces with James Cagney, that their poverty was why they turned to crime. That James Cagney, who's revered by this gang as a killer and a robber, that he came from a bad neighborhood, the Bowery, and the liberal-leaning Jewish movie makers of the 30s start planting the seed in Depression-era America, where the American dream seems not to be working for so many people, that maybe the environment has something to do with it. So in terms of popular culture, and of course, can never underestimate how influential important movies are, that seed is planted. But I do think this is the first novel I know of where that idea is not only a substantial argument in the novel, but it takes up the last third of the novel in the character of a white attorney.
Sure. Well, because I was also it reminded me of, there's a line in West Side Story, the leader of the Jets, I think his name's Riff, when they're going back and forth with Officer Krupke, and the line is, "I'm depraved on account of I'm deprived," to explain
Yeah.
the behavior of the gang.
In Fugitive from a Chain Gang, with I can see the actor. He played Louis Pasteur, Paul Muni. He is someone who falls on hard times, and once he becomes a damaged person, he's not hired, he's cheated, he's paroled, and people take advantage of him. And it's clear that society is at fault. And when he sees his former fiance, and she wants to help him, and he steps out of the shadows, she says to him, "How do you live? How do you live in this marginal world?" And he says in a famous line, the closing line of the movie, "I steal." And he takes a step backwards into the shadows. And again, that's a 1930s movie. I will say, while we wait to poll people, we're going to call on you, but maybe this is a good time to say that one of the things that's happening in America in this part of its history is that there is a great migration, and that's what it's called, a great migration, from 1910 to 1940. There's a second wave, but in that first wave, 1 million Blacks migrated to northern cities, mainly New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. In some cases, whole communities from North Carolina went to Pittsburgh, and people from Louisiana went to Chicago, or so on. I'm not saying that's the right alignment. That's how it works. Um, by 1960, when the US population was 180 million, 11% of that population, about 20 million people, were Black. And in 1960, 75% of them lived in northern cities. That's a remarkable change from the early decades of the century. And it's not just that they're northern cities, it's that they're northern cities, because most of the Blacks from the South lived in rural environments, not suburban environments, farms and villages. And by 1960, 75% of the American Black population were living in northern cities. So one thing is this great migration, which puts Black people out of their background into an urban environment. There's also the issue, of course, of the Great Depression, which is not solely a Black phenomenon, but gets mixed in here. World War II, and especially the idea that the world is a more violent, more fearsome place than it might have been in the time of Betty Smith in 1910, where her novel begins with the word serene, and it's a beautiful, sunny summer Saturday. You couldn't get farther removed from that ringing alarm clock. Communism as an idea that becomes attractive to some American workers and thinkers, and not just an idea out there in the economic stratosphere, that has its place in the culture of mid-20th century America, and even more so, existentialism, which America started to embrace. And of course, I'm not talking about your average person on the street any more than your average person on the street in 1940 was particularly interested in Richard Wright or race relations, and maybe not even in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. But those people who were craving something from culture to get rooted again, there was a widespread rebellion in many arenas of American life against the complacencies of the 1950s, the man in the gray flannel suit. And this would range from eruptions in the cultural landscape, minor ones like those in popular culture, like the ascendance of the teenager in Rebel Without a Cause or Elvis. Elvis was 1956, Rebel was 1955. Jerry Lewis made one of his stock farcical movies called The Delicate Delinquent in 1957. And when parodies start to be made of something, you know it's actually gotten a cultural foothold. When you can have a major filmmaker, which Jerry Lewis was to become, make a movie comedy making fun of delinquent, you know that this idea of teenagers, you may remember, I date myself, that there was a show called The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis in 1959. The idea that 10 years before, there would be a radio or TV show that would talk about a teenager as the center of attention. But the other way that existentialism took hold in terms of a rebellion against the vapid lack of spirituality in materialistic America was that Camus and Sartre found many, many more readers of their literature in the 50s. And that was partly through the work of Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, whose Invisible Man comes out a few years after Native Son, and the work of someone like Saul Bellow. All right, Michael, you have anything?
We've got a few comments for you to react to. So I'll just take them in order. The first one said, "Could you talk a little more about the title, Native Son?"
No, because I just made it clear that I'm hoping that I hear from people about how they found the book.
Then
So
I will go.
I don't mind being listened to, but I don't like being ignored. I'll get to that question eventually, but what I'm hoping many of you in the room will say something about, as an individual reader, what did you think of Native Son? That's the thing I can't tell you.
Well, that's the next two comments will be right on that target.
Excellent, excellent.
I tried hard to be sympathetic to Bigger, but I couldn't get past his rape and murder of 2 women. It was just too much. At the end, he was saying he was all right to his lawyer, and I couldn't stop thinking about the 2 women and how they had no voice or agency.
Yeah, and I want to say that I understand completely that response, not that you need my understanding to validate it. And I want to say that I think if Richard Wright were here, he would acknowledge that that's the challenge he set up for himself. How can I get white America to see that the worst you can imagine of one of our young men, and he's been violent before we meet him. He's a gangster. He's killed, he says. He uses knives and guns. He's not trustworthy in the least. He is a bad N-word. So that's a double blow in terms of how white America thought of blacks in the 1930s and 40s. And what Richard Wright is saying, even so, this is a young man, part of whose character has been formed by the fear he lives in with all the time. And, you know, people who work in race relations, whether professionally, or you might be a healthcare provider in an inner city hospital, or a school teacher in an inner city, and you realize that people of minority culture, I think it's still true today, but certainly true in 1940, live with fear all the time, all the time. I'll tell you a very short story that's absolutely true. I did, more than a decade ago, the novel To Kill a Mockingbird as part of a One Town, One Book in Waterbury. And one of the groups I did the book with, and I did multiple, I did one in a courthouse, I did one in a bookstore, I did one with a women's reading group where they were largely African-American women. And this might have been early in the 21st century. And one of the Black women, a grandmother, said in Waterbury, so not too far from where you are or I am, in the 21st century, that her son, her grandson, who was a middle schooler or a high schooler, was coming home from school, and he was proud to tell his grandmother that a woman in a car called him over from walking home. She didn't get out of the car. He was on the sidewalk. And he was proud that he was able to answer her question about how to drive to a certain street. And he was proud to tell his grandma that not only did he know how to tell her, but he helped this woman. And the grandmother, telling us the story, said to him, "Was this a white woman?" And he said, "Yes." And she said to him with increasing anger, "And did you go over and lean next to her at the car?" And then he got nervous. He said, "Yeah, did you touch the car?" Well, I was kind of pointing down the road. And she chewed him out and said, "Don't you ever go near a white woman alone for whatever reason. Just say you don't know and walk on." And she was telling this story weeks or months after it happened because of her fear for her grandson in Waterbury, Connecticut, in, I'll say, 2004.
Great, really interesting story. Next comment says, trauma and violence and despair caused by systemic racism seems to be the source of Bigger's behavior. Hate breeds hate.
Yeah, and I want to say that I want to make it clear to everyone, one can do many, many things with literature. I mean, literature is basically anything that's written. And my instincts always are to move towards having people, whether people here in the Wilton Zoom room or my undergraduates or high school students that I've taught, to become better readers. So I try to concentrate on what you might notice about patterns and themes and how you can become a better reader of any literature. But in the series that I've been doing now for a couple of years with Wilton, including back to the Victorian novel and the modern British novel across the Atlantic, we're looking at cultural themes and how they show up. So I want to make it clear that one of the ways you can talk about this book is as a semi-realistic enactment of a way to see society. And for some people, that's a good reason to read the book and is it self-fulfilling. Some people like novels of ideas, novels with messages, because it's food for thought. Some people find that there's not enough food for thought in a novel like this because there's not enough novel. They'd like some of the characters around Bigger to be something more than just props. And if they have a true distaste or judgment against Bigger, it makes it that much harder, because what you can adhere to in a novel where the protagonist is not normative, not someone you can admire, you can find that you're admiring the text, the prose, the climate of the book. This is a beautifully written book about a son of a gun. And I don't care about, and I don't mean this novel in particular, but I don't care about the quote unquote anti-hero, but it's just so brilliantly written about this evil character. That happens quite often. You attach your affection or association with the style, the language, rather than the book. But when you don't have a good story in the conventional sense, and you don't have characters populating the world who make for an interesting cultural network, and you feel that the novel is putting forth a despicable person that you have no interest in reading about, that's a tough sell. And all I'm saying to you all this evening is that's what Richard Wright wanted to try to do. Wanted to say, white America cannot appreciate how many young Americans, and he included whites as well in his introductory comments, and he wrote an essay that I think in most cases is attached as an afterword to the book, How Bigger Was Born, where he tries to explain that this is not race specific and its background, and that he knew a number of men who would fit this description of being a bad N-word. I do think he is to be praised for trying to get America to see, you have been hungry, you have struggled without enough heat in a cold winter, but you have not had things done to you because of the color of your skin, without people even knowing whether you're an Irish immigrant or a German immigrant like Betty Smith, or Irish, or so on. You have not lived with real deprivation. And deprivation is a word that people use, but most people do not live lives of deprivation in your standard American novel. They're disadvantaged, they have bad luck, they fall on hard times, but actual deprivation that is culturally enforced. Remember, even after the Emancipation Proclamation and the Second World War, there were lots of people in America who believed that Black people were not people. And that until the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was not only legal, but many people thought of it as admirable because it made good use of these unintelligent, beast-like creatures. It gave them some comfort, and it helped the Southern economy. It was not apologized for, it was defended. 1860 is not that long ago from 1940, and 1940 is not that long ago from 2022. I'm not lecturing anyone in the group. I'm saying the complicated issue with this novel is he's making it tough for himself so as not to make it easy on us.
Good point.
Now,
So
Michael, I want to go back because I want to respect the person who asked that question. I didn't want to seem scolding.
That's
I just
okay.
wanted to get to some feedback. So
Well, I got a couple.
the
I have a
title
couple
Native
more.
Son, of course, I know, but I want to give this person props for asking and not keep him or her waiting much longer. So I'll just say that, of course, Native Son means someone who has the country in their blood. I'm a native son of Ohio, and it's meant to be bragging, meant to be proud, and that, you know, people from Indiana have the spirit, and I'm a true native son. And of course, it's always son because the male dominance of the bias. And of course, what he's saying is this man who has been marginalized, who can barely think of himself as a human being, let alone an American, is an example of what America produces in its own people. It is a darkly sardonic, ironic use of the phrase. That's what I would say in answer to that questioner.
Got it.
Thanks.
So I got a couple more feedback comments. I felt it was a powerful and a great American novel. I read it only about 5 years ago. Wright doesn't flinch. He doesn't try to win sympathy for his protagonist, but he does enter imaginatively into the character's mind, and his control of his tale is masterful.
Yeah, I want to say I really appreciate that comment, not just because I agree with it, but it uses a lot of good language about this. I will also say, in terms of the level of literary achievement in the book, you must have noticed, if you read the novel with care, how often Bigger is responding viscerally to his environment. He's clenching his fists. He's clamping his teeth. He feels that he has white people inside his gut. He has absorbed in his physical body the state of racism. You know, that's why blood pressure and diabetes and obesity is endemic in Black communities. I mean, everyone knows this. It's not just that they're lazy and they eat badly because of cultural background. It's a way of self-medicating in a society where a grandmother has to say to her grandson, step back. Don't be so proud of helping white women and leaning on their cars when they have their driver's side window rolled down. And that's an extraordinary thing to think about.
Yeah.
Go on,
So
Michael.
I got one more so far. Although the novel pushes us towards a despairing view of race in Bigger's story, I still think of it as snowy, atmospheric, and tragic all at once. 50 years on, I can still see it all.
Well, and then another, I applaud that comment as well, because I think it's a very cinematic novel.
Yeah.
I think that even though it lacks depth in terms of the characters, the scene setting, the tension of being in that bedroom where Mary has just been suffocated, the tension in the basement with that horrific scene with the furnace, the long scene where he rapes, gets her to drink, and then you know he's moving towards killing, hits her with a brick. I mean, just the sheer animal bestial force of it. Very cinematic. The chapter, they're not chapters, the long passages on his flight. Some of that cinematic power goes out of the third book. But I agree with that as well. And I do think the snowiness of the novel is not just that it's set in winter in an urban landscape, but that white has consistently been used as connected to white society, and also as something that makes it harder to see. The white, you drive through a snowstorm, you know what I mean. I wonder if I could give you all a little sidebar to try to make maybe a clearer explanation of why I think Wright quite intentionally makes it a tough pill to swallow to care about Bigger. A couple of weeks ago, I did a unit with in a retirement community in Connecticut on Melville's story Benito Sereno, which some of you may know. If you've never read it and hope to read it, I'm going to spoil part of the plot for you. But the book's power, it's a novella, it's a long short story, is not just in this reveal. So an American captain comes across off the coast of Chile a disabled Spanish vessel, which has on board hundreds of slaves. And he takes a whaleboat and he goes to see if he can help them. And the captain of this Spanish schooner, that is a slave ship transporting slaves from one place to another, is Benito Sereno. And he tells the captain, Delano is his last name, who's come, the American to help, that he lost all of his men to disease in a storm. He lost some of the slaves. He's getting by now by having some of the slaves work on the ship as free men. He doesn't have a first mate anymore, and he has as a servant a very wily and powerful black man, a slave, at his side at all times. And in the course of the novella, Delano keeps thinking something's really wrong here. That white boy was struck on the head by a black boy and no one did anything about it. There must be something wrong. And he keeps convincing himself that there's nothing wrong. He keeps in his own head, and like this story, it's third person oriented narration. They're talking about Delano, but we're in his head, like we're in Bigger's head. And every time he gets close to thinking something's terribly wrong, he thinks there can't be anything wrong. And Melville's point is that Delano is a schmo because he is so good-natured, he is so innocently trusting as an American, he has such a high respect for the African race and thinks that slavery makes good use of their abilities, that he's horrified when he goes off the ship to go back to his ship. Benito Sereno, the captain, jumps onto his ship and says, "Save me," and finds out that the slaves have revolted, taken over the ship, killed all the officers, and are trying to get to some place to be free, the way that the slaves revolted and took over the Amistad off of Cuba and were defended by John Adams and so on. And there were several different slave revolts of ships in the 1800s before the Civil War. This scene is set in 1799 by Melville, farther back into the past. But the reason he doesn't see it is because he has been blinded by how horrific slavery is. And when the novella came out, most people's reading was Melville, who's interested in the human psychology of darkness and self-deception, thinks these blacks have done a terrible thing, killed white officers and taken over a ship, and this foolish American doesn't see it. It's a accusation, indictment of these slaves for doing evil, and that the thought of critics of the day was that this story was about an American's naivete not being able to see the evil of what these black men have done. And critics in recent years, that is to say the last 50 years or so, have come to see, Melville died before the end of the 19th century, that that's exactly wrong. What Melville is saying is that man is so foolishly optimistic, he doesn't comprehend that these slaves did what they had to do to try to be men, that they are fettered in the bowels of a slave ship and being abused as part of the Spanish economy, that people are doing this legally and commercially with the bodies and souls of human beings, and that the evil is not that the black man rose up against his oppressors, it's that he was oppressed in the first place. And it's so far spread that people reading the books, living in the culture of slavery, even if they thought they were abolitionists, don't see it. That's the world, decades before this novel gets written, that Richard Wright is trying to write against. Pretty powerful story.
That really is. Okay, so we have another comment that has popped up. It says, though we can't condone what Bigger does, we understand that fear imprisons him as a black man, disparaged and controlled by the white man. Rape and murder frees him for a moment.
I think I would largely agree with that, although I'll say that it's not the rape and murder that frees him, it's his contemplating it after the fact and thinking about how he has to own it, that gives him some sense of something like an acceptance of his fate. He says at one point in the novel, when he's still trying to debate whether he should accept what he did. Remember, he does terrible things after those terrible things. He tries to frame Jan, who's one of the few people who helps him. He extorts money from the family. I mean, he is a bad person through and through. But it says at one point, and this is a quote, he knew that the moment he allowed what his life meant to enter fully into his consciousness, he would either kill himself or someone else. He knew that in the moment he allowed what his life meant, which is nothing, to enter fully into his consciousness, he would either kill himself or someone else. And remember, the narrator says about him that he never lied to himself and said that he killed Mary by accident. He said that he's a white man, he's a black man in a white woman's room, and he killed her because he had to kill her. And that sense of fatalism is another strain through the book. One of the things I haven't mentioned when I've mentioned existentialism and the Depression and communism, that is to say, a way of thinking about anti-American values and still remain an American. Richard Wright writes in his memoir, Black Boy, that when he read that Americans could join the Communist Party and accuse America of not being democratic or good, that he was amazed that you could do that in America, that communism gave him hope that it wasn't just Black people who were dissatisfied with the country, that there were some white Americans. I mean, they belonged to the Communist Party, but they were white Americans, and he had a whole new vision. One of the things Bigger is trying to work around is he accepts that he did it intentionally, and he can't quite, he has to work towards wondering why that would be intentional. Yeah.
Well, that's it for the questions or comments, Mark. If you, I don't know, we're coming up on 8 o'clock. If you want to just make
Yeah,
some
well, I'll
concluding
say one
comments.
more thing, because there was one more ism I wanted to mention. And again, I'm talking about this in this novel because it's so much a reflection of a crisis in culture at this time. Another thing that he inherited and picked up on was naturalism. And I'll give you a little bit of history in the 3 or 4 minutes we have. So one of the things the 19th century did in Europe and England, and then it came to America, was it suggested that there's something in nature that has an affinity to human life. And one aspect of it was the romanticism of daffodils and rainbows and water, and the idea that the child is father to the man, and my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. The Wordsworthian Coleridge notion that we have an affinity for nature that tends to be positive and joyous. But the other side of it is that we are creatures of nature, and that nature, as Tennyson said, is red in tooth and claw. It's the survival of the fittest. And that human beings are determined, that's the word they used, by forces in them that come from nature, like the sex drive, or the drive to dominate or have power, or ambition, self-centeredness, all these things. And so you had an outcropping of writers in the late 19th, early 20th century. Zola is a main proponent in France. Theodore Dreiser is an excellent example. American Tragedy, a wonderful novel from the 20s, is a great example of this kind of determinism of a bad white man who is being presented sympathetically because he's a native son. I mean, you could call American Tragedy, if you know it, Native Son, and it would make perfect sense. And you could call this book that we're talking about this evening American Tragedy. It makes perfect sense. And the idea of naturalism is not that people have no moral responsibility whatsoever, but people, when they're disadvantaged, when they don't have a good education, good role models, good food in their belly, good income, are going to revert to their natural state, which is not a positive thing, but this dark thing about these forces like will to power, as Nietzsche said, that there's something in human nature that wants to dominate. And Wright absorbed that in his writing about American culture. Now, when we turn to A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which, as I said, begins with the word serene, that's the first word of the novel. Instead of being cold and wintry, it's summer, it's a Saturday. I think the word wonderful appears a handful of times on the first pages. And instead of ending, and this won't ruin the novel for you, it's just an image, but instead of ending on a clanging steel door, it ends with Francie, the girl who is admiring of this tree that's growing in Williamsburg, closing her window, that is, going back inside her house and having talked to someone across the way, closing her window because she has a window to close and she has a home. Just the opposite of the image at the end of Native Son. Now, I'm loading the case when I put A Tree Grows in Brooklyn alongside Native Son, but I defend it by saying they're published 3 years apart. They were both wildly popular. Again, you could hardly think of two more different books. And it was the popularity of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, 1943, that led publishers to create what was called a pocketbook that were sent to men overseas because it was their pocket that the book had to fit in. It fit into the military regulation size uniform pocket so that men overseas could read novels. And one of the first ones was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Not too shabby. That's where we go next time.
That was great, Mark. This was, I think, a really excellent lecture, and also really good comments raised by folks. Certainly a book well worth reading, even though it's kind of tough. But as we learned tonight, that it's got a lot of very interesting characteristics that really make it worth the effort.
So I'll make two final comments, Michael. One is, I really want to underscore what Michael said earlier. If you have questions, send me emails. I never want anyone to think that I'm being short with you when I say I don't want to talk about that now, because I know that if you take me at my word, we can always follow up. In the case of the person I asked to wait, you see, I answered pretty quickly. And the other thing I want to say about this novel, don't hold your breath for the musical.
Yeah. All right.
Thank
great.
you all.
Thanks, Mark. We'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll see you all next Thursday.
Thank you, Michael.